good eyes for doing that. The third eye looks out at the holographic matrix of informational totality. And then the problem for that form of perception is filtering.
Would you say that another word would use the word?
Well, Atman means soul or being, or yes. I mean, it's simply that consciousness is distributed and holographic, and nobody has their brand on it. What we have been calling human consciousness is the only consciousness there is. It's something you tap into, not something you evolve out of yourself. I mean, you required a local language to create a local model of this universal input. If your local language is insufficient, then you abide in a domain of intuition. And that's what I would call animal consciousness. It's a domain of intuition of being. Animals intuit being. But given a more advanced nervous system, a more advanced cultural toolkit, the intuition changes into a direct perception. And you begin to make poetry and experience loss and feel love, and you begin to feel the emotional outlines of the enterprise of being, and how far one can go into that. I assume it's infinite, or at least appears infinite from our limited position.
So the local languages? Well,
the local languages is a necessary compromise. It's interesting, the thing that makes psychedelics so central to a discussion like this is they are the only thing which pulls the plug on the illusion created by local language. That's why people are both in love with it and terrified of it, because it addresses a fundamental aspect of reality, and it addresses it incontrovertibly. And people who feel culture as a safety zone that is keeping at bay the black oceans of God knows what are not interested in taking psychedelics. On the other hand, people who feel confined by the cultural dream and who want to cross the black oceans of who knows what to see what's on the other side, they embrace that same experience as a God-sent gift. But it's the same phenomenon. So it addresses, one's own fundamental relationship to the unknown. Local languages, like local cultures and architectural styles and everything else, are designed to create, I think, an infantile sense of security. One of the bees up my rear end these days is the idea that culture is not our friend, that we have been very naive about what culture is and how it is something designed for the convenience of the species. And, it could turn you into a janitor or a banker or a celebrity or anything else with no interest or concern for whether that's good for you. It plays with individuals, and, most people think, or at least I think most people think, that when you get to be, 30, 35, 40 or something, you have jumped all the hurdles. You got your college degree, you had some children, you made some money, you lost some money, maybe you had a marriage, maybe you had several. And anyway, people sort of get the feeling, well, I've done it. actually the major adventure still lies ahead. And the major adventure is to claim your authentic, true being, which is not culturally given to you. The culture will not explain to you how to be a real human being. It will tell you how to be banker, politician, Indian chief, masseuse, actress, whatever, but it will not give you true being. And maybe this is the voice of somebody who just turned 50 talking, but I thought it would get simpler. It doesn't, because this rejection of culture thing is the last and hardest step to take. And there are all kinds of impediments to taking it. The fact that in middle age, if you've played the game right, you get a lot of money. That's totally stultifying in most cases in terms of going forward to the next level. It's almost as though culture is an enterprise, self-organized, to buy you off at the moment when you might be most dangerous to its values and goals.
To humanity trying to reach harmony.
Well, you know, in Revelation, the Ancient of Days is described as there's a sword which comes out of the mouth. It's a very hard image to picture, but a sword, a turning sword, which comes out of the mouth. And of course, the whole Western myth of creation is the world was made by an utterance. In principio et verbum et verbo caro factum est. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was made flesh. And in some sense, I think the what is not stated there is that then out of the flesh, the Word must be redistilled. That's the second half of the historical process. In this book, which I may mention at some point, the statement is made, God created man in order to taste the bitter fruit of time. In the DMT flash, the entities that appear, their entire program is a program of language acquisition. And, you know, this is a point that's brushed over in science fiction films because it's actually such a conundrum. Those of you who saw, and you suffered as I did, Mars Attacks, the little role for Rod Steiger in there as the German guy with the translation machine. Well, if you think about alien contact, real alien contact, we cannot assume that universal understanding is easily achieved. The very first aspect of true alien contact would probably be a language lesson of some sort, because the aliens don't want to communicate about our gross national product or our political system. If they do, they're not really aliens. They're just odd-looking people from far away. Real aliens have something really alien to communicate, and it can only be communicated in an alien language. So I think it's very suggestive that these invisible entities that we contact, when we dissolve the local language boundaries, and they're like mud walls built around our little hut of mental, you know, our collection of goats and stuff that we've pushed together. And then we dissolve the walls, and, you know, there's alien people, there's alien minds out there waiting to trade with us. They probably have always been trading with individual geniuses through dream, through insight, through imagination. I mean, many of, you know, if you've read Thomas Kuhn's book, The Structure of Scientific Revolution, you know that even in as constipated and self-conscious an enterprise as science, the real breakthroughs occur in situations of delirium, frenzy, drunkenness, inspiration, and then guys, usually it's guys, spend the whole rest of their professional life trying to make it all sound reasonable and rational and how it proceeded from earlier work done by other people and so forth and so on. This is just a fantasy, a kind of way of attaining respectability. Well, yeah, I mean, Hinduism and Hebrew, and I think those are the two biggies, have really elaborate theories of the power and the place in the universal scheme of things of certain tones, and it's as I was sitting, I was thinking Sufi, and then I was also thinking Pythagorean. I mean, some people call this the Pythagorean impulse, the belief that basically the universe is harmonious and exists as a series of octaves, and that if you know the mechanics of this, you can converse with angels, you can ascend to higher levels. Yes. Again, it's an issue of language. I mean, some languages fill your pockets with lead, and some languages, give you a helium balloon for plunging into these metaphysical areas. One thing I wanted to talk about this morning, and maybe this is the place to get into it, is we've spoken of the imagination as a seemingly boundless realm, but it's not ruleless. And the people who encounter it without rules often have very difficult experiences, the most difficult of which can be raving madness, I would think. And so if we're going to embrace the imagination as the new benchmark of being, then we need to talk about what the rules are that obtain in the imagination. The 14th century nominalist William of Ockham dealt with questions like, can God do anything? Yes, God can do anything. Then can God make a rock so heavy that God can't pick it up? And then if not, why not? And what does this mean? Well, this is an effort to tame the imagination. And Ockham concluded from exercises like that even God must follow the rules of logical necessity, otherwise becoming trapped in self-negating paradox. So I am thinking about this. I listed 3 areas where rules might be gleaned that could be applied to the imagination. The first 2 are linked somehow. Mathematics. Mathematics is not what you think it is. Mathematics is basically rational thinking about defined sets of entities. And since the imagination is nothing but defined sets of entities, the rules which govern them are worth learning. In practical terms, what this comes down to is logic. And one of the problems that I think haunts the current cultural impasse is the fact that there is a lot of hostility to science, and it has spilled over, and science we should be very suspicious of. It's a wonder worker. It's a magician dealing its wares in the marketplace. So we should be suspicious of science. But this scientistic paranoia has spilled over into a suspicion of reason. This is too much. if you abandon reason, you will have nothing to guide you but the emotional depth of the situation. And this is what Heidegger called the depth of the call. And in the 20th century, the history of following the depth of the call has not been a happy one. We cannot trust the call of the blood uncritiqued by reason. Reason is primary in this situation. Well, so then many people say, well, mathematics is impossible, logic is difficult. Isn't there a third possibility? Isn't there yet another way to get a handle on this? And the answer is yes, but I'm not sure it's easier. It may seem at first easier, but that is aesthetic. The imagination must serve the ideal of the beautiful. I talked about this a little bit last night. That which is tasteless is to be avoided at all costs. And 90% of the difficulty in your intellectual life would never have happened if you had just had better taste. Am I not right? You know? I look at this Heaven's Gate thing in amazement because of its tastelessness. That's all. I mean, it is utterly unappealing for that reason. I don't even have to reach for the club of logic. If it had been better scripted, I might need logic. But the aesthetics of the situation are just so overwhelmingly, the suicide cult that eliminated itself in San Diego. Yeah. Well, usually people ask me what will happen in 2012, and I say, it's like asking a man facing east at 2 a.m., what will sunrise look like? In other words, it's too early to ask. Well, I think that, I don't have an answer to the problem of the bully and the slave, unless, as the Marxists claim, that is inimical to disparity of wealth. Because I think disparity of wealth is a transient phenomenon based on a limited technology. But it is entirely possible that we can make everyone a king, and we will still have bullies and slaves. So if the Marxists are wrong and the addressing of the economic disparity doesn't change the structure of the human soul, then we will have to go deeper. And I don't know how this is going to look. There's a lot of tension in any community that discusses this kind of stuff over where the body lies in all of this. Can we solve our problems and maintain our individual existences? Or are we in fact furiously building a level of hierarchical control above the level of the individual that will make things like states and corporations seem like pale soup indeed? Are we in fact trying to create a super organism? What is the relationship of an idea like that to classic fascism? Well, what about the internet? I mean, is it the coming of the superorganism? It is prosthesis on an incredible scale. It is going to redefine what it is to be human. I think technologies are neither gods nor demons. It's what you do with it. The dilemma of human freedom is that we don't know where we rest in the universal hierarchy of good and evil. In other words, what would we do if we could do anything? Would our transcendent impulses drive us to a kind of angelhood? Or, as James Joyce says, would we flop on the seamy side? And the answer normally given is some would do one and some the other. Yes, but what if we erase that possibility of individual action, and is there then only one destiny? And then what shall it be, and who shall decide? I would be fairly pessimistic if I saw this all going on a level playing field, but it isn't going on a level playing field. Transcendence is favored. Nature seems to be in the business of building systems which transcend themselves. We can see that as far back in time as we care to look and throughout all of nature. So it seems like we actually have a hell of a tailwind helping us toward the transcendent other. Probably that is what will make the difference. We couldn't have done it by ourselves, but we happen to be in a universe which is itself involved in the process of bootstrapping to higher levels. Yeah. Well, traditionally, meaning since the invention of print, the artist has had this role where the eccentricity and the bohemian lifestyle and so forth of the artist was tolerated because the argument was the artist is a kind of antenna for this mysterious thing called the future. And the artist would sound the alarm and bring the news. In a sense, we don't do this kind of talk anymore because this is the future. You know, we have become the very thing our parents warned us against. Those cheerful dreams of endless progressivism that built up the 19th century and early 20th century have given way to a much more cynical and sophisticated understanding that our buildings may become taller, our automobiles shinier, but somehow the human animal is not moving forward at the same rate as our technology. So what we have to do then is give people opportunities and let the devil take the hindmost. At least create a world where those who aspire to transcendence are not blocked in the aspiration. And of course, it's not that some of us are these pure aspirants and others the haunters of the sleazy side of the internet. We each play all these roles and move in between them according to taste and need. I mean, one of the great falsities of print is the making illegitimate of schizophrenia. I mean, we are all just swarms of personalities. The idea that a healthy person has a unified identity is just a silly idea. It's like believing that sexual preference comes in only two flavors or something. It's one of those incredibly weird simplifications that once made, everybody lines up and salutes, no matter how much agony it causes the individual. Yeah. Well, last night what I said was that I was a Platonist, and that Plato felt that the world was approached through three paths: the good, the true, and the beautiful. But that goodness is controversial and truth difficult to discern, but that beauty has a kind of resonant self-evidence. And so following beauty, it's my faith will lead to the good and the true. And some beauty is, I'm a fan of extreme forms of beauty. Hieronymus Bosch and Redon and James Ensor. The beautiful can be grotesque. Of course, this then opens up a whole aesthetic can of worms that maybe we don't want to get into. Well, beautiful art is never bad. Yes, I think grotesque, the beauty of the grotesque is the unique modern contribution to the discussion of beauty. And it's a higher form of perception. It's all very fine to find beauty in wildflowers and women dancing in diaphanous dresses and harpsichord music. And it's quite another to find beauty in ripped up railway tickets and found objects and smashed machinery and that sort of thing. The modern sensibility has been unsentimental and has, in that sense, I think, advanced the canon of beauty. Modernity, I'm feeling much better about now that it's over. It's such a huge enterprise to look back on, what faith, what simplicity, what naivete those people possessed. I can hardly get over it. The 20th century, for all of its brutality and its flirtation with the dark side of the human soul, the counterpoint to that was its incredible optimism and idealism and simplicity. The simplicity of fascism, the simplicity of Marxism, the simplicity of democratic political theory. These are ideologies that clearly never met a human being. Yeah. Well, the idea of an attractor, you see these huge thought structures that we live inside that we're not even aware of. And one of them is the idea that causes precede their effect. This seems like a non-statement to most people. Of course, causes precede effect. But in fact, processes, if causes always preceded effects, then many, many processes would be unpredictable that are in fact predictable. And this has to do with this word we introduced last night briefly, the creode, the runnel, a given process, the destiny of a people or the evolution of a political system or the growth of a series of interconnected scientific ideas is not in fact free to develop in any direction it wants. It is going on in an epigenetic environment of intellectual confinement of some sort. And in the same way that water runs downhill, a given idea developing in a given time and place will predictably develop in a certain direction. One of the very large creodes that we can see at work in nature and society is what I call the conquest of dimensionality. Biology is a strategy for moving into and occupying ever more dimensions. And biology begins as a point-like chemical replicating system attached to a primordial clay in the proverbial warm pond somewhere at the dawn of time. And as life develops, it folds itself. It becomes a three-dimensional object. It replicates itself in time By that means it claims the temporal dimension. After 2 or 3 billion years of that, it has evolved itself to the point where with strong muscles it can move through space. With superb visual organs, it can coordinate its exterior environment. And finally, through the advent of language, it can tell its story. It can move information around not present. And as soon as you begin to code that information into stone or magnetic medium or whatever, in a sense, time has stopped. You are moving outward now. And this very large creode seems to inform not only biology, but the human enterprise as well. So when I talk about stuff like the evolution of photolithography and moving pictures out of photography, and the evolution of surround sound and the global airline system and these kinds of things, these are dimension-conquering phenomena designed to shrink the Earth to a point. And of course, the internet is the mother of all dimensional conquest. I mean, in a single 40-minute session on the internet, I may talk to computers in Helsinki, Australia, Paris, Vanuatu, you name it. And I don't even notice that this is happening. Yeah, it doesn't matter. It's meaningless to think in those terms because, in fact, you might as well think of it all being inside your CPU sitting on your desk. It has the same effect. And what that is it's the sum total of human knowledge being daily augmented, and the fury with which people put their thing on the internet, everything from, how grandma's recovering from her stroke to, I visited a language site the other night that had 122 syllabuses for 122 languages that were philological engines for searching these languages. I got there through the Vonich manuscript site. Yes, that all still goes on. That community is at work. So apparently we will not rest until all space and all time is brought down into, for all practical purposes, a single point. And this is an idea that has been around in various forms since at least the 16th century. I mean, it's the alchemical idea of the philosopher's stone, a universal panacea, a medicine which makes you wise, immortal, all-seeing, all-knowing, all good. But interestingly, conceived as an artifact of technology, conceived as something brought into being through the effort of a technological worker in concert, in resonance with the intention of nature, which is to do the same thing. The human world is simply a catalyst for nature's intention. We are speeding up nature's program of dimensional transcendence. Nina. It is. It is that, and it is in a sense the Jungian unconscious, but no longer unconscious. In a sense, what we're saying is, we all, before the internet, you were who you are, you knew what you knew, and you knew there was a great deal that you didn't know. You had once known it, but forgotten it, or never learned it, but somebody somewhere knew it. And because we had this vast, dark companion, the unconscious, bad things keep jumping out of it. It was remarkable to me that throughout the Cold War period, we're a planet ruled by carnivorous monkeys. filled with ideological hatred, under immense economic and social pressure, and yet nobody ever used atomic weapons except one, the two Japanese instances. And in a sense, they don't count because they didn't know what it was. They had to use it to see what it was. And once they saw what it was, remarkable restraint set in. I would never have guessed that we would have been capable. I mean, remember how deep the fear of the Soviet Union was. Remember that for 35 years, a thermonuclear strike was a possibility within a half an hour of any undue movement on the other side. And yet, somehow we got through that. So there is in the human animal an effort to awaken. You know, it was H.G. Wells who said history is a race between education and catastrophe. And you know, it's a white knuckle enterprise. You know, catastrophe edges inches ahead, education moves ahead. And again, if it were a level playing field, I'd be betting on catastrophe because I believe that nature favors the good, the true, and the beautiful. I've got all my money on education. I think we'll make it, but I think we have to scare ourselves to death in order to keep focused. You know, we're primates, and we don't really dig in and get rolling until we're painted into a corner. Yeah, no. I guess the answer is you have to somehow make it your friend. You have to make it your friend. There are ways to do that. Actually, I made a little list. You played right into my hands. The first and probably oldest friend, older even than psychedelics, is dreams. Dreams are hugely important. I was in Australia in February, and I did a lot of reading up before I went down. The Aboriginals of Australia have been at the cultural enterprise for a long, long time, along a different path than the rest of it. I mean, I spent time with Amazon tribes and with people in Central Asia, and yes, they're funky, and yes, they're different, but these Australian Aboriginals are on to something quite other. Many people barely open their eyes. People sit silently. People don't talk. This again relates to what we said about language. In Australia, among these people, you get the feeling that they don't talk because they're not sure it's here to stay. If an Aboriginal wants to communicate something to you, they would far rather walk with you a half mile into the bush and point at it than to simply describe it back at camp. So the dream time and the Jungian unconscious and the unconscious made conscious by the internet begin to sound like the same thing. I previously didn't have much interest in the Australian Aboriginals because I was slightly irritated by reliance on psychedelics. And so it was like, what am I supposed to do with these people? They're clearly very loaded and very far out. And how do they do that without drugs? It was paradigm agonizing to me. Well, it turns out that they just are better at keeping secrets than the people in the Amazon. There's a revolution breaking over ethnobotany. We have been saying for decades that South America was the most hallucinogen-rich ecology on the planet, and why was that, and wasn't it fascinating, and so forth and so on. In the next 18 months, some Australian ethnobotanists and trippers are going to publish data that shows that the Australian Aboriginal worldview is entirely running on DMT. These acacias, this gum tree ecology that stretches from Queensland down to the south coast, is replete with DMT. It's simply that the Aboriginal culture is even more secretive than other cultures, other Aboriginal cultures in other parts of the world. And only very, very slowly is this information being let out. So dreams are one of the great friends of the imagination. Yeah, that's what I'm saying, basically. And there'll be more. It's not for me to take the thunder. Very good people have hundreds and hundreds of pages about to be published, and they've got the data, and they've done the analysis. Yeah. Well, I pretty much take the position that there may be people who can do it on the match, but there's no technique. It's something you have to be born to, and there's no culture that can do it. I think throughout the human population, there may be one person in 100 who has a futuristic set of synapses. Because I occasionally, in a group like this, somebody will come up to me and say, well, I've never taken a psychedelic drug, but I know exactly what you're talking about, and I see visions and so forth and so on. I used to just think that these people were nutcases. I've now encountered enough of it that I modify my position to say these are just incredibly fortunate people. And you can't tell how much of it is personality and how much of it is chemically real. Again, how much of what I'm saying to you right now is being processed differently in every head in the room. Some people are seeing pictures. Some people are hearing words. Some people are logically building on what I say, and for some people it's just music. And so it's very different, and again, it's something very hard to share because it's so subjective. But throughout the world, there are what we would call primitive or aboriginal cultures, and some are drug users and some are not. And it isn't a matter of ecology, it's a matter of something else. In eastern Ecuador, you have tribes that are just totally druggy, and across the river, people who never touch anything, living basically what appear to be unschooled observers, two cultural systems not that different from each other. So, it's but generally speaking, the psychedelic cultures seem more, let me put it this way, the psychedelic cultures seem less dogmatic. Shamanism comes in two flavors, at least two. There's what I call a traditional shamanism is very rigid and ritual driven and usually non-psychedelic. And the other kind of shamanism, there are rituals, but they are basically for the consumer, not the producer. And what shamans in these psychedelic cultures are simply alienated intellectuals. I've been in situations in the Amazon where you fly into some remote place and the people come and the women come and they want to touch the airplane and they want to look at your camera and touch your clothes and all this. And so while this is going on, meanwhile, standing off is the shaman. And he doesn't give a shit about the airplane or your camera or any of that. He is interested in you as a person. And what he is he's alienated from the values of his culture. The keeper of the values is the one person who knows that the values are bullshit. That's what they're doing in that function. It's like somebody has to know. And so all the people are, kowtowing and going through their business. But the shaman at the top realizes, my God, we stare out onto an abyss. We do not know. And they're like scientists. I mean, they are scientists. Yeah. Well, this is an interesting question. There's a hard and soft answer. It depends on whether you think the need to commodify is so basic to human beings that it can't be removed. If that's true, then the internet still holds out a certain amount of hope. A hardcore anti-capitalist position wants to eliminate capitalism because it sees it as an unreclaimable evil. But it's possible that the only thing wrong with capitalism is that it manufactures, distributes, and commodifies physical objects. What if there was a capitalism that only commodified information and life? That might be more tolerable. In the future, not that long in the future, if you want to live at Versailles, it'll cost you $149 to buy the software package and set it up and live in it. Well, if Versailles can be made to cost $149, how much is it worth? And the answer is only what the market will pay. So I think for a long time, this process of raising standards of living has been underway. And it is certainly true that today in the world, hundreds of millions of people live better than emperors and kings 2 centuries ago. So I think the important thing, well, before we totally dismiss capitalism, we should see if it can operate in a virtual informational environment less destructively. If it can't, then something else will have to come along. But certainly capitalism based on the extraction of resources and their fabrication by cheap labor population into objects to be sold in a central economy, that's finished. That's a dinosaur. That's self-limiting. Because there is not an ultimately exploitable resource base, the end of that kind of capitalism is easily discerned. Well, that's an interesting question. Is there a kind of natural selection of means in the marketplace? There probably is. For example, imagine governments deal with information completely differently than corporations. If a government obtains a proprietary technology, its impulse is to classify it, move it out of sight, and exploit it for political advantage. If a corporation achieves a proprietary technology, it drops a huge amount of money on promoting it, rushes products based on it to market, and tries to spread it everywhere as fast as it can. This certainly has caused an evolution of certain kinds of technology. But the two systems, the capitalist corporate system and the governmental system, value and put emphasis on different kinds of technologies. For example, nation-states use war as an instrument of national policy. Corporations almost never do that. Corporations don't like war. It busts up environments, it makes products difficult to move around, and where you had happy, healthy customers, you now have hollow-eyed refugees standing around with their hands out. But those were national interests. No corporation could have launched a war like that. It wasn't Exxon who had a knife poised at their throat. It was the economies of France, Germany, and the United States. Also, that war was generations ago. A completely different set of political rules were in place. That was probably the last of those sorts of wars, I would guess. What capitalism does with war is it exports it to already burnt out market areas, like Rwanda, Bosnia, Albania. They don't care what people do to each other in those places because they don't have, there's no market there anyway. Let me go on with my list here. I think I got through dreams and drugs, which were probably the biggies. This is friends of the imagination, in case you lost your place here. Fiction and the enterprise of fiction, not necessarily science fiction, although it's interesting if you look at the golden age of science fiction, the magazines that created that had names like Amazing, Astounding, and If. These are the very words and themes that we've been pursuing around here. But fiction is, until we get virtual reality up and running in the hands of a master, the best way we have of showing each other the content of our own heads. Any of you who have made your way through the Remembrance of Things Past, Proust's enormous novel about symbiotic life in Paris, there are thoughts uttered there that are so fragile and delicate that when you read it, you think you were the only person who ever thought it, and you never bothered to mention it to anybody because it seems so ineffable, and yet Proust has gotten it down on the page. So it shows you what human beings are. And of course our world, pardon? I'm trying to think of an example. There's an example where they're going to a beach town and he's riding with this dowager woman, a great society woman, and he's watching the trees go by the carriage, and he notices that, now how does this work, that the nearer trees move faster than the trees further away. And then over this spatial metaphor is mapped a temporal metaphor about people changing in time. And, you know, God knows what it is in French, but even in English, it's this exquisitely complicated thought that you wouldn't think anybody could actually do justice to the feeling, and yet there it is in its completion. The other great friend of the imagination is travel. Travel is another way, a more gentle way, to break down cultural conditioning. I mean, what we call culture shock is when you go to Afghanistan or Albania and you realize that your expectations of how a table should be set, what a toilet looks like, how a bus ticket works, and how a telephone is supposed to operate, were just so narrowly defined that now you're confronted with a telephone and a toilet and you don't even know which end is which. And it's not for nothing that the vocabulary of psychedelic experience has borrowed from the vocabulary of travel. So we take a trip, we have a journey, we go to an alien landscape, And then finally, the great friend of the imagination is the future, because it's in the future that we place our hopes, our fears, our suppositions. I mean, the future is a land of things imagined, things that have not yet undergone the formality of actually occurring. Yeah. As a friend of the imagination? Well, did I not mention last night that the two great motivators were food fantasies and sex fantasies? And yes, the sexual imagination is at a very early, I almost said primitive, but I don't mean that, but I mean early level, because if I'm understanding you correctly, it revolves around the if operator. If I approach the desirable female with the proper blandishment, and then of course just sexual fantasy, then we will do this, then we will do that, and so forth and so on. It certainly is a vehicle for altered state, whether I would call them imagination or not. I suppose I would, but now that I'm thinking about your question, I think, there are pitfalls in the imagination. And probably the sexual pitfall is sentimentality. Well, tastelessness is in there too. Sentimentality is a virulent form of tastelessness. And sentimentality is very hard to root out. You may think you're a hard cookie, but I'll bet there are areas of sentimental delusion so broad and deep in every one of us. And some people carry that to the grave. They're the lucky ones. The rest of us have divorces, bankruptcies, muggings, and what have you, and slowly our sentimentality is pounded out of us. And, it's a good thing to lose sentimentality because it's a false aesthetic. And I think we recognize it. It's also a very easily manipulated. It is truly a false aesthetic in the hands of modern media because it is a great ploy for buying. If you can induce sentimentality in people, they will buy the object of that induction. Yeah. Well, your word idealism is good here because it brings me to something I always eventually get to, which is in line with this thought: culture is not your friend. Ideology is not your friend. And ideology, some people think what we're trying to do here is sort out good ideologies from bad. Should I be a Marxist? Should I be a deconstructionist? And the answer is no, none of the above. All ideologies are viral infections of some sort, mimetic infections that erode your functionability and your comfort with yourself. Ideologies set up polarities that are based on discontent. And ideologies are always based on false premises. Name an ideology and I'll tell you the false premises that it's based on. So part of this process of cultural maturity that I've been talking about is to get beyond ideology without embracing cynicism. It's not a fuck you thing. It's a deeply saddening awareness that we are not yet angel enough, that we should take ourselves that seriously. Yeah. Yes, I would say sentimentality is the feeling of attachment we have to our ideology. So, for instance, someone says, well, you know, Marxism, maybe we didn't have the right answer, but we certainly had a sense of a mission and a wonderful, we knew who we were, and that's crazy talk. If it was wrong, it was wrong. I mean, it's like old Nazis sitting around saying, the great old days, what was so great about the old days? You want community? Join a bowling league, for crying out loud. Yeah. No, that's a lesser evil. That's nostalgia. Another impulse for marketing frenzy. Well, let's see here. I think what we have to do is think in terms of the exhaustion of our own cultural forms. I mean, that's what we're living through, is a global dying created by the exhaustion of our cultural forms and the vitality of the cultural forms that we see in these so-called primitive, I call them pre-literate people. As Nicole pointed out, they have nothing. But what they seem to have that we cannot seem to get a grip on is a kind of dynamic equilibrium with their environment and peace of mind in the felt experience of the moment. These are the two things we don't have. As a society, we cannot seem to make peace with nature. As human beings, as individuals, it's very hard for us to be at peace with ourselves. I mean, I consider my own life the search for peace of mind. Forget enlightenment, forget shunyata, all this stuff. Just a little peace of mind would be a tremendous boon as far as I can see. So I really think that there's a confluence here of themes and possibilities. It has this richly plotted texture that always lets you know that you're in the presence of a higher order of things. It's that the shamans whom we admire, who we idealize, are seen to be at the center of this environment, the warm jungle, the tropics, the warm tropics, that we find it necessary to destroy. So it's a perfect image of us being at war, not only with ourselves, but with nature itself. And you've heard all about how the Amazon and the Congo Basin in eastern Indonesia are all being cleared and lumbered and turned into cattle ranches. This is a tragedy, obviously. We understand and can perceive the dynamics of that. But how to make sense of a situation where, as the World Bank and the IMF attempt to halt this kind of destruction, on the other side of the coin, the United States State Department and the DEA and these agencies propose and are planning to carry out the defoliation of the Waijaga Basin. So there's a schizophrenia here that is not academic. I mean, are we trying to get the patient well, or are we pulling the plugs one by one? We seem to be acting in both dimensions simultaneously. And I think it's because we have not in this culture awakened to the depth of the crisis that surrounds us. There's a lot of kind of self-congratulatory backslapping going around these days over the fact that communists everywhere are in hot water and have to admit that they did it wrong. And this gives a lot of satisfaction to people who feel that means we did it right. We didn't do it right. They did it wrong and now admit they did it wrong.
We do it wrong and have yet to even raise the possibility of turning away from what we are doing. The internal contradictions of Marxism were based on a false definition of what people are. People do not respond to central planning, hortatory propaganda, and stereotyping. Neither do people respond to an ethos of self-denial or a view of human beings that denies the fact that we have certain itches which must be scratched. So, I think that the collapse of Marxism is only the collapse of the outer edge of the societal and civilizing assumptions that we have made. After all, Marxism is nothing more than the millenarian retread of Christian millenarianism. And so is modern science, yet another secular retread of Christian millenarianism. So our culture is in trouble, not trouble. We are at a terminal crisis, a bifurcation that it can only go one of two ways: horror beyond your wildest imagination, or breakthrough to dignity, decency, community, and caring beyond your wildest imagination. Now, where do you look for models? Where do you go? The answer is so obvious. You go to nature. Nature has been playing this game for 3 billion years on this planet. We have been playing the game, we, the apostles of Christian scientism, for about 2,000 years. Nature has an economy, an elegance, a style that if we could but emulate it, we could rise out of the rubble that we are making of the planet. It was the geographer Carl Sauer who said, man found the planet a climaxed primeval forest. He, and notice the gender here, he will leave the planet a weedy lot. A weedy lot. Well, now this is a metaphor where you change climaxed rainforest for weeds, but it's also true. By clearing land, we promote the kind of plant evolution that stresses very rapid seed production and annular cycles of growth. In other words, weeds. And this tendency to find perfection and then to leave rubble in our wake has haunted us for the past 3,000 or 4,000 years of our history. Now, with the ozone shield disappearing, with acid rain falling on the earth that can melt blocks of marble, with the CO2 levels rising, with the levels of strontium and chlorofluorocarbons, and the litany, we have now one last chance to fish or cut bait. And the place where nature has provided the models for how to respond to this situation is the climaxed rainforest. Only the climaxed tropical rainforest has the kind of complexity of signal transfer, movement of nutritional materials, movement of electromagnetic radiation that we find in the modern city. It is a cliche of modernity that the city is a jungle. The problem is it isn't jungle enough. And I think it's the task of the new shamans to take the metaphor of the jungle, which is a metaphor of tremendous wealth, tremendous variety, a tremendous outpouring of form and of energy and of potential fulfillment of various bifurcation patterns of flow, to take that and enrich our own lives with it. And the way this is done is by empowering the presence of experience. The main thing that you get with these so-called primitive, pre-literate people, and with people like Nicole, who have spent time in this situation, is they are in the moment. They know how to have fun. They know how to work. They know how to live. And the reason they understand this is because they are focused within the confines of the felt presence of experience. They do not live by abstraction. And abstraction is the knife poised at our hearts. We are so much the victims of abstraction that with the earth in flames, we can barely rouse ourselves to wander across the room and look at the thermostat. That's the level of disimpassioning that abstraction has laid upon us. Well, hopefully this weekend there will be passion. There will be an effort wherever there is abstraction to drag it down into the felt presence of the moment. I think basically what we are a kind of green anarchy, an effort to revivify social forms that have been atrophied in the West at least since the destruction of Eleusis, probably in most places thousands of years before that. This is our last chance. I have done the best I could in terms of trying to sift through all these options, and as a communicator, offer the best way out. And, you know, I could only do my best. And so that's what you get. I can't preach scientism because I don't believe in it. I can't preach Buddhism because I can't understand it. The only thing I can preach is the felt presence of immediate experience, which for me came through the psychedelics, which are not drugs, but plants. It's a perversion of language to try and derail this thing into talk of drugs. There are spirits in the natural world that come to us in this way. And so far as I can tell, this is the only way that they come to us, that it's rapid enough for it to have an impact upon us as a global population. This weekend will be different because we will be hewing close to the source. Nicole is a priceless repository of information, more even than she knows. If I could declare her a national treasure, I would. The number, who knows what this woman knows? Who knows how much human suffering, the alleviation of how much anxiety lies in the hands of perhaps half a dozen people of Nicole's caliber who have paid their dues in these jungles. This information is flowing through our fingers and disappearing. In another 30 years, it will be all gone. Every time I go to the Amazon, I can feel the way in which it's slipping away. When my brother and I go off looking for these unusual hallucinogens, often we have the experience where when we finally find the person who claims they know what we're after, the line goes like this: well, I've never taken it, but as a child, I remember seeing my grandfather prepare it, and I think I can do it. If it weren't for us standing there asking that it be done, it would never have even risen into the gentleman's mind as a possibility. This is the knife edge upon which this knowledge is poised. If it can be saved, it gives me hope that we can be saved. If we can't save this kind of knowledge, we cannot save ourselves, because this kind of knowledge is ourselves. Culture is a garment which you put on. Medical systems are pieces of jewelry which you wrap around your throat or neck. Religious ideals are like objects which you push through pierced nostrils and earlobes. If we cannot come to terms with that which allows us to give birth with ease, to die with dignity, and to live in health, then what kind of a future do we have? No future at all. So this is not a meeting of obscurantists or enthusiasts for some private vista of transcendence. This is a meeting of political activists, people who are socially committed to themselves, to each other, to the larger idea of community, and who understand that when you talk about Gaia, it's only an abstraction unless you talk about plants. The division between the masculine and the feminine is only trivially a difference between men and women. It is fundamentally a division between plants and animals. Plants are the enveloping feminine matrix of control and refurbishment. Animals are something invented by plants to move seeds around. An extremely yang solution to a peculiar problem which they faced. So the archaic revival, if it means anything, it means reconnecting the Gaian mind, which is a vegetable mind, a feminine, enfolding, boundary-dissolving, planetary mind that is not an abstraction, not a stereotype, not something used to create hortatory propaganda, but a living, breathing reality, a reality which is the only thing which stands between us and Armageddon.
History is a kind of horrified realization that something has been lost, that there is an itch hard to scratch in the civilized context, that we have, out of fear, really descended into patterns of domination of each other, of the environment, of our children, of our social relations with exogamous groups. We have descended into a dominator pattern that is basically based on clutching, on fear. And I'm sure most of you have heard me argue that this is the consequence of ceasing basically to do enough hallucinogens in the diet. That, in fact, what human beings were flirting with over many, many tens of millennia, let's say from 100,000 years ago to 15,000 years ago, human beings were in a flirtatious situation with a symbiotic relationship with this mind resident in vegetable nature. Now, you all know that what classic symbiosis is in biology. It's where, let's take the example of the little fish who lives in the sea anemone, and big fish don't bother it. It gains protection. The sea anemone gains access to larger prey, which come to investigate the little fish. That kind of symbiosis is genetically locked in. And if you take the little fish away from the anemone and put it, let us say, in an aquarium without anemones, it doesn't die. It doesn't go into an immediate physiological crisis. No, what happens is it simply has a low body weight and a short lifespan. In other words, it is under stress. And I believe, I hope I'm not deluding myself, but I believe that the lost secret of human emergence, the undefined catalyst that took a very bright monkey and turned that species into a tormented, self-reflecting poet-dreamer, that catalyst has to be sought in these tertiary alkaloids in the food chain that were catalyzing higher states of intellectual activity. And I've pointed out to you ad nauseum, I'm sure, the reciprocal feedback relationship that was working there in the case of the mushroom, in the Veld situation in Africa, it was promoting at low doses visual acuity, which was feeding back into the hunting and gathering process, making those animals with this increased visual acuity more adaptively successful, hence more reproductively successful, hence they're outbreeding their competitors. at higher doses, psilocybin actually causes a generalized arousal, which includes sexual arousal. Again, it becomes a catalyst for increased reproductive success. More instances of copulation in a situation like that lead to more successful births of those into family structures where the alkaloid has been accepted into the food chain. Well, this would be only an obscure topic of interest to primatologists were it not for the fact that it is a crisis in consciousness which confronts us globally. Consciousness is the commodity that if we do not have enough of it, do not produce it fast enough, then the momentum of the processes we set in motion in our ignorance is going to sterilize the planet and do us all in. So we have to have consciousness. Well, then you look at the smorgasbord of ethnographic possibilities and you discover this institution of shamanism. It is the institution of planner, of visionary, of manager, of large system coordinator. That's what it's about. You call it magic on one level, you call it curing, you call it folk psychiatry, or weather prediction. Shamans have been involved in all of these things. But as Nicole was made so eloquently the point last night, to these deep forest people, it is ordinary. It is ordinary. They live in a different cultural dimension than we do. Dimensions which to us are completely value dark are to them completely transparent. And dimensions which to us are extremely rich and complex, the inner world of the nucleus of the atom, let us say, are for them totally value dark. They don't even cognize the possibility of asking the question. But nevertheless, the specialization in these various domains is not something where one is as good as another. Consciousness is the domain of immediate experience. How are we going to save this planet? How are we going to take the lethal cascade of toxic, technological, and ignorance-producing habits that are loose on this planet and channel them toward some kind of a sane and livable world? Well, the answer is emerging in culture out of the collectivity of global consciousness. It is what I call the archaic revival. It is this very large turnover in the mass mind. Some people call it a paradigm shift. It's an effort to recover the sensory ratios, the feelings, and the attitudes of 15 to 20,000 years ago, before fear, before ego, before male dominance, before hierarchy, hoarding, warfare, propaganda, child abuse, all of these things. And the answer lies, as was indicated last night, in integration into the dynamics of nature. Well, so far as my analysis gives it to me, the only way you can abandon yourself to the dynamics of nature is to break through the language shell. You must cut through the aura of programming and cultural assumptions that surround us from the moment we are able to speak. The only way this can be done is by dissolving the boundaries of ego. Ego is a structure that is erected by a neurotic individual who is a member of a neurotic culture against the facts of the matter. And culture, which we put on like an overcoat, culture is the collectivized consensus about what sort of neurotic behaviors are acceptable. Now, I don't know, so you see, what I see going on in the Amazon is a very radical psycholytic therapy, where they are dissolving, literally dissolving the boundaries of self, culture, and ego assumption. And then what you discover is not the white light, or what William James called a blooming, buzzing confusion, although in the first few minutes it can be like that. But what you really discover is sentient, organized, living, loving nature. That nature is a force. Nature is a mind, a personality, organized with intentionality, organized with feeling, humor, grace, and conviction. Conviction. And if you can get right with that conviction, then that's the secret of dancing in the waterfall. That's the secret of the shaman's apparent transcendence of the rules of mundane statistics. Because that is what it is. The shaman doesn't violate physics. He or she simply knows how to push the improbable to its greatest extent. And in Eastern philosophy, this is called the Tao. You know, abandonment to the flow, fitting of the small pattern into the larger pattern. Well, I think these things are very important because I think that psychology, psychiatry, psychoanalysis, it's a good idea, but it will never reach any kind of operational effectiveness until we look to these native healers all over the world and study their methods. And their methods are chemical and personal. It's a combination of care, attention, intention, and chemistry that allows consciousness to be made malleable and then recast in other forms. So I find myself this weekend explaining myself. That's what I feel like I'm doing. Why does someone who extols the self-transforming elf machines of the DMT space also claim to be a conservationist, also, have a mathematical dog and poodle show? Well, it's because all of these things emerge out of the concrescence of consciousness, its intention toward its own transformation. Nature is the answer. It's not enough to be like Wordsworth. It's not enough to, this is not, Mao Zedong said the revolution is not a dinner party. And certainly the ecological revolution is not a dinner party. Poetic sensitivity to the death of the planet is not what we're striving for here. What we're striving for is to halt, overturn, and back out of the impending death of the planet. It is very clear now that consciousness will decide that the planet, there are not rosy futures of suburban housing and ratatouille to be extended endlessly into the future. We are approaching a bifurcation where it is either going to become heaven or hell, one or the other. And I think that this archaic intuition, which I see reaching clear back to the birth of the 20th century and the 19th century, back to people like Alfred Jarry and Guillaume Apollinaire and the pataphysicians, the surrealists, the physicists around Einstein, Freud, modern art, modern dance, jazz, all of this stuff is an effort to reclaim the primitive, to reclaim the archaic, to reject all that powdered wig algebra that comes down through the French, English, German tradition of constipated male dominance. And instead, intuit, that's what it is in Freud and Jung and the New Age, and intuit our way out. But now we're close. The intuition is rising to the surface. We no longer have to operate without the presence of the goal firmly in hand. The goal can now be stated. What this is all about is a return to archaism. with the lessons learned in history. That's where we were happy. The fall was a fall into a veil of tears, into a world of limitation and pain and suffering and infectious disease and so forth and so on. It's a prodigal journey into a lower dimension that can now be ended by a collective cultural decision to commit to this Taoist, shamanistic, feminized, cybernetic, caring, aware, present kind of being. I mean, it's nothing more than what each of us is in our very best moments. But we have to extend those very best moments to fill whole lifetimes. Think of the number of people who suffered and died that we could sit under this tree this morning. I mean, in the last million years, 9 times the glaciers have ground south from the poles, freezing the world into ice and confining human populations to subtropical valleys and the warm tropics. 9 times the interglacial periods have come and human populations have spread out over the earth. They didn't have radio, they didn't have antibiotics, contraception, statistical analysis, or the partial differential equation, and yet somehow they managed to get us here. Are we then, as the heirs of that wave front, of the inheritors of a billion-year process, are we in one generation to turn it into a massive pottage? I think not. I certainly hope not. I would like to believe that we could make that leap to conscious awareness that would allow us to take hold. Now, the problem, it was easy the first 10 years that I sat before you, because what we were doing was getting to know each other, to verify that we in fact existed, that I wasn't crazy, you weren't crazy, so forth and so on. Now, what looms ahead is the mess of politics. And this, I'm sure you have no stomach for. I certainly don't. I'd rather be stoned and rocked in the arms of the goddess. But as a matter of fact, this dominator thing is not going to be unhooked and put to bed without a struggle. Everyone is going to have to be counted. I've talked to you in recent months about memes. Memes being the smallest potential units of ideas. They're like genes. We are the nucleus of a mutant meme, the meme of plant consciousness, hallucinogenic consciousness, shamanistic consciousness. We have to refine this meme, replicate it through repetition, and spread it through society in the same way that a plant sheds seeds into an ecosystem. The idea will compete. The idea is a good one. It's adaptive, it's clever, it's tough, it's invasive, it can make use of many contexts to promote its own existence. But it can't do any of that if we don't replicate it and get it out. So I see these kinds of meetings as an opportunity for building community, as an opportunity for people to look around themselves and connect with the other people who are here. We cannot be told from the rest of the population unless we self-select and gather together at a single point in space and time. When we do that, we recognize each other. When this meeting is concluded, we will merge back into the larger stream of the body politic. But carrying this meme of the Gaian resurgence, the Gailanic wave that must come. I mean, people say it's so wonderful that you articulate these feminist ideas and so forth. I do it because I don't want to be dead. I do it because I don't want my children to have no world to live in. There is no choice. It's the walls are high and the current is moving very fast. What we need to do is merely keep our spirits high and learn to sing the song. my friend Ralph Abraham is a proponent of this school of mathematics called chaotic attractors or dynamics. And this is the notion that many processes are not pushed from behind by the momentum of casuistry, as in the ordinary Newtonian model of process, but that there are what he calls attractors, or basins of attraction. And these are things which lead processes forward. For instance, a somewhat trivial example would be if we had a large bowl and a marble, and every time we released the marble up near the rim of the bowl, we would notice that it unfailingly rolled to the bottom of the bowl and located itself somewhere near the center of the bottom of the bowl. We could say that the bottom of the bowl acts as a basin of attraction for the marble. In other words, the marble finds its most, that its energy state is most at equilibrium when it locates itself in the trough of the bowl. So there is a way of analyzing processes to see them as though they were led rather than pushed. And I think it's fruitful to see human history this way. You see, what we deny as a culture of materialist, positivist reductionists, is the presence of spirit in the world, in ourselves, or in nature. And so Western science is very concerned to deny what is called telos. Telos is a Greek term for purpose. Purpose. The same idea as the attractor that I was trying. If you have a target, if you're driving a car toward a goal, the goal is your telos. It decides how you will steer the car. Well, it has been for the past 150 years extremely fashionable in sociology and biology because of Darwin to deny telos in nature, to say that, you know, any apparent order in nature is made up of the disorder of random mutation meeting the disorder of natural selective processes, and these two streams of converging disorder create a kind of apparent or virtual order, which is an illusion. This is the orthodox theory. And when you take this Darwinism and put it into historical theory of human processes in time, you get the modern position in academic philosophy about history, which is that it is, and the official phrase is, trendlessly fluctuating. That's what we are asked to believe we are embedded in, a 10,000-year-old process of trendless fluctuation. In mathematics, this is called a random walk. It means you just go over here a few steps, and then you go this way, and then you go back. You're like a drunk, lurching around in this space. And this is the highest vision of human purpose that the reductionist vision can offer. Well, what the intuition of religion is, especially Western religion, and I wouldn't even bother to mention it, except that it also is the strong intuition of a lot of psychedelic experience, that there is some kind of attractor in the historical phase space. There is something which is drawing everything toward it. It's like a higher dimensional entity that casts an enormous shadow over the human landscape, so that, you know, at sitting around campfires 50,000 years ago, people felt this vague tug toward organization, order, cognitive activity, epigenetic activity. Epigenetic activity means coding stuff not in your genes, but in dance, gesture, ritual, and ultimately in clay and on paper and in electronic storage methods. This proliferation of complexity is a response to and an anticipation of this transcendental object at the end of historical process. You see, if it weren't for our presence on this planet, even modern science at its present primitive state could give a fairly good accounting of what's going on, that out of complex polymers arose super complex polymers which were self-replicating, and that was life, and then you have an animal population. But the fly in the ointment of this rational model of reality is ourselves. We are clearly imbued with a higher dimension, which we call spirit, in a way that ordinary matter, when imbued with a higher dimension, is called life. In other words, we represent a different ontological level in the career of organization, because we hope, we despair, we plan, we remember, and we misremember. You know, we lie, we fabricate, we delude ourselves and other people. All of these things are uniquely human functions. Well, I think that shamanism, which is the focus of our concern here, is a kind of anticipating of the whole pattern. And that this is really the way to think about shamanism when thinking of it as a force that can steady and complete an individual human life. The shamans are not in history in the same way that we are. By having access to this higher dimension that they go to in their trance states and their states of intoxication, they gain a fractal overview on process, on life. I mean, after all, isn't that what we mean by wisdom? Wisdom is understanding how things really work, how they really work. Love affairs, the raising of children, the managing of corporations, the prosecution of wars. How do these things really work? Not the deluded and fumbling attempts of the proponents of this or that school, but a Taoistic insight into the actual appropriate dynamics of everything. Well, how do you gain that kind of an insight? The answer is you must have a superior model. You must have a superior model. Now, if you believe, that the world is composed of 3 levels and they are held up on the back of a woman who sits on a giant tortoise who floats in space, this is a model of the universe. It can take you a certain distance. But what model of the universe can actually offer reassurance in all kinds of situations? Well, strangely enough, I think that these models come from the frontiers of mathematics, that it is not mere coincidence that the storms of visionary hallucination that the shaman encounters are very much like the storms of form and color that are spewed out of a Cray 3 supercomputer when it conducts 1,000 iterations per second inside the Julius set or the Mandelbrot set or one of these other compound complex mathematical objects that we are beginning to see. You see, mathematics up to this point has been a computational science because mathematicians used pencils and blackboards and chalk to describe their objects, and consequently an excruciatingly difficult vocabulary kept most people from appreciating what mathematics was about. Now, the computer is to modern mathematics like the telescope was to 16th century astronomy. The computer becomes a window into domains of hyper-complex computability that previously could barely even be conceived, but that now, at a rate of millions approaching billions of iterations per second, Ralph works on the MMPP machine, the multiple parallel processing machine at Goddard Space Flight Center. It does 800 megaflops per second, 800 million floating point decimal calculations per second. Well, you can dream dreams with a machine like that, and strangely enough, at the edge of the super technology of the dominator culture at Goddard Space Flight Center with guys, high priests standing around in white coats, when you get it up and running, what you see is what an ayahuasca shaman sees on a Saturday night in the Amazon. You see that you are navigating through a complex, higher dimensional phase space where, by varying the inputs of amplitude and frequency, in one case using an electronic box, in the other case using the human voice, you sing your way through a mathematical domain which is a higher resonance of reality. And you learn how the world really works, how things happen. Well, how the hell do they happen? Well, on the simplest level, they happen like this. They have a beginning, they have a middle, and then they die away as an oscillation, a damped oscillation. Now, this simple truth to which we all nod assent is, in fact, the hardest thing, the hardest swallow there is for the dominator ego and the dominator personality. Because what this simple truth says, things come into being, they achieve their inflorescence and they fade away, is, as Heraclitus put it, pantithrea, all flows. Nothing lasts. Nothing is saved. And this is, our glory and our agony. That, the people we love and the people we hate are swept away by time. Empires, dynasties, continents are swept away by time. And yet our search for security is cast in the dominator culture as a search for permanence. I want to buy a house. I'd like to get my trust fund functioning a little better. I'd like to pay off X, Y, and Z. A search for permanence. So what you do when you do that is you set yourself at war against the cosmos, which is a heroic stance if you're trying to produce Melvillian opera out of your life. Ahab says in Moby Dick, he's talking to his first mate, Starbuck, who signifies Christian right reason. And he says, he's raving about going after the whale. And he says, we'll chase it over both sides of earth and round perdition's flame. And Starbuck says, to seek revenge on a dumb brute seems blasphemy. And he says, blasphemy, Starbuck? Speak not to me of blasphemy. I would strike out the sun if it insulted me. For could it do that, then could I do the other, since there is ever a sort of fair play. Well, this is locker room talk. The notion that there is fair play between a man and a nearby star is the finest expression of the dominator ego I can imagine. And of course, the story of Moby Dick can be read on many levels, but finally, it is the story of the submersion of the male ego in the oceans of the unconscious, born to its destruction and transformation by an encounter with the maternal matrix in the form of the vagina dentata of the sperm whale and everything that it symbolized. So I don't think we want to go that way. I don't think we want to set ourselves up as the crusaders for permanence, but that means softening to the fact of the flow and of the impermanence. Nicole has made the point very eloquently that these people in the Amazon have nothing. The wonderful thing about the Amazon is that nothing lasts. Nothing is worth having. I mean, a book, forget it. Clothing, houses, everything is just swept away by the incessant recycling of material. So all that is permanent are values, personality, strength, honesty, decency, dignity. These are things which can be erected against the flow and have some hope of permanence. So I think shamanism is permission to transcend anxiety by accepting the transience of all form. And this is a truth of the universe that cannot be ignored. So once it is integrated, then it's as though resistance in the electrical circuits that surround your integration into the world begins to fall. You accept that the present moment is the richest apex of being, that on the downside back into the past, it shades off into memory and its vagaries. In the future, it shades off into a series of adumbrations and anticipations. I think that the shamans gain this tremendous authenticity that you feel in their presence, the good ones, because they have seen the end. They have a model of how process happens, and so they don't push and they don't clutch, and then energy flows through them. And our civilization has to learn this. I think I said at one point in this weekend, only Gorbachev is taking the position that we did it wrong and that we need to deconstruct. And yet every society did it wrong. We all did it wrong. Capitalism, it's wonderful that you can get a safety pin at 4 a.m. within a half mile of anywhere in the United States. And I'm sure the Russians wish they had it so good. But is that the be-all and the end-all of cultural values, that you can walk the fluorescent lit aisles of Kmart and congratulate yourself that whether it be gas can, sanitary napkin, or whatever, it's there waiting for you? I don't think so. I think that we have built in the termination of our world just as surely as the Marxist world built in a tripwire into its social mechanism. It's just that we're going to have to pay the piper more downstream. If we descend into the dominator metaphor and play its game, we're probably going to be snookered, because they've had a long, long time to figure out all the angles. What I find myself more and more leaning to is sharing the meme of the irrelevance of conservative institutions. History is not a process for which you ask permission. History is just something you make, and then other people pick up the pieces. Henry David Thoreau understood this very well when he wrote his famous treatise on civil disobedience. The growth of culture is something that comes out of the animal body. Rousseau called it the general will. Man proposes and God disposes. But in the realm of civil polity, the people dispose, and government is allowed to propose, but that's all. And now what we are involved in really is a debate about human nature. Who are we? What are we? The French cartoonist Mobius put it very well in his book, where he asked the question, is man good? This is what we're going to find out. And my feeling is that it isn't decided yet, that it is, H.G. Wells called history a race between education and disaster. Well, they're in the home stretch, neck and neck. It's clearly going to be a photo finish, but there is a responsibility on everyone who sees this to communicate it to other people and to act upon it.